We'll start officially. Welcome to today's event. I'm Jackie Jones from Herefordshire Green Network's Building Sense group, and we're delighted to be able to host Dave Green's presentation today on behalf of the Future Ready Homes programme. Future Ready Homes is running in Shropshire, Powys and Herefordshire, and it's being delivered by Marches Energy Agency and 7Y Energy Agency with the support of groups such as ourselves, HGN and Lightfoot and others. The main focus is to promote and support good practice energy retrofit homes across the Marches. And part of that is being able to provide a certain number of free energy surveys and retrofit plans. The scheme is looking for a good cross-section of building types, a good cross-section of situations. So sadly, not everyone who applies is going to get the free survey, but please do apply if you're interested. And even if you're not successful, you'll be helping us with important learning. So we'd appreciate that. Finally, I'll introduce our speaker, Dave Green. Dave is an experienced energy assessor and advisor. Many of you will know him through his work with Lightfoot and the Household Energy Service, others for his work on community energy schemes and share energy. Dave has also done work for the National Trust, the Central England Co-op and Marches Energy Agency. He's Secretary of Shropshire and Telford Community Energy and Chair of Midlands Energy Professionals. Today, though, he's going to be speaking as a householder, telling us about his own experience of improving his house, fitting a heat pump, and coming up with a dazzling reduction in carbon emissions. So, Dave, finally, over to you, and thank you.
Thank you, Jackie. Yes, I do want to emphasise that this is a personal, this is about experience. This is what I've done, why I've done it, and what the results were. So if the questions can be relating to my experience, questions about why I did things, why I didn't do something else, how it's worked, am I warm enough, rather than the theory of heat pumps, which I think has been covered in a couple of other Hereford Green Network webinars already. That would be great. If you've got more theoretical questions and there is space at the end, maybe we could squeeze you in, but I think we'll probably run out of time. Anyway, this is my house. It's a 1930s semi-detached ex-council, 86 square meters. When built, it had uninsulated cavity walls, no insulation in the loft, single glazed metal frame windows, open coal fires. The energy performance certificate rating was probably G. And it would have had carbon emissions of around 12 tonnes a year, possibly more, and it would have been very uncomfortable. Now, I bought it in 1997, which unbelievably is now 25 years ago, by which time it already had double glazing. It had 100 mil of insulation in the loft, and it had a mains gas, back boiler and radiators. And it used, the first year I was here, maybe 16,000 kilowatt hours of gas, something like that, and around 2,500 kilowatt hours of electricity. So carbon emissions around 4 tonnes a year. Now, I fitted a wood stove, which I hardly ever use because the house gets just too hot when I light it. Extra loft insulation. I did underfloor insulation in the living and dining room, which is a job I was fairly uncomfortable doing 25 years ago and wouldn't attempt now. Cavity wall insulation, not straight away, because there was some subsidence at the back of the house. So I wanted to check if it was still moving, basically. So after a couple of years, we got the cracks in the mortar fixed and a bit of strengthening in that corner, and then we fitted the cavity wall insulation. And I have to say that we noticed a difference straight away, not only in the fuel bills, but also in the fact that the house stayed warm. Previously, if you switch the heating off, the temperature would have dropped quite quickly. With the cavity wall insulation, it holds onto its heat much better. We also did a bit of draft proofing and fitted an electric shower. So we got the gas use down to around 12,000 kilowatt hours a year. and the electricity was basically the same. Carbon emissions now around 3 tonnes a year, so we'd made a 25% reduction. Later, about 10-12 years ago, I fitted 8 solar panels and a condensing gas boiler. So we got the gas use down to 8,000 kilowatt hours a year, electricity purchased down to 1,500 kilowatt hours a year, and carbon emissions down to under 2 tonnes per year, not allowing for export to the grid. We could allow for that. We could also allow for the fact that I'm on a green electricity supply, but that just complicates things. So I'm not allowing for that in these figures. So last year, I decided to replace the gas boiler with an air source heat pump. Now, the gas boiler was only 10 years old. It was already causing problems. It was costing me £300 a year to keep it maintained, because that's the only way I could get it repaired during lockdowns. It was relatively efficient, but it's still using mains gas, which is it's a carbon fuel, it's a fossil fuel. So I really wanted to get my carbon emissions down even lower. Now, I found an installer recommended by a friend, a company called MJS of Prestine, who I have to say I was very happy with, and I'm not on a commission. I told them that I only wanted the heat pump to do the heating, not the hot water. I'll come back to that. They calculated I needed a 7 kilowatt heat pump. I would say 7 kilowatts is the output. It's not the amount of electricity it uses, and recommended fitting larger radiators and a buffer tank. Now, to get the grant, if you want a grant towards a heat pump, you have to fit a heat pump that's large enough to heat the house. You can't fit a smaller heat pump, say, oh, I only want it for background heat, and claim the grant. But replacing the radiators is your decision. It's only a recommendation to increase the radiators. But I changed all the single panel radiators in the house to double panel ones, except in the 2 bedrooms, which we don't really heat. So it's very easy. You know, literally they're the same size radiators, they're just double panel instead of single. In retrospect, the one in the living room would ideally be a little bit bigger. I mean, it's fine, but there are occasional evenings when I'm tired and spent too long on the computer and my blood's not flowing much, then it would be nice to have a bigger radiator in there, but mostly it's fine. So this is the heat pump that we fitted. Jackie's pointed out it looks enormous in this in this picture. It's not enormous at all. It's it's just under 1 meter long and just over 300 mil deep, and what is it, 600-700 mil high. It has to have a gap behind it, and there has to be space in front of it for the air to get away, because it sucks air in from the back and blows it out the front. And this is actually, mine is high up on a wall. It's I can walk underneath it just, and it's up there because I've got a sort of lean-to shed down the side of the house, so there wasn't room to put it down at floor level, but normally they go in at floor level. Now, as we've got an electric shower, we rarely use the bath. There's a cold feed on the washing machine, so the only hot water we use really is for the kitchen and the bathroom sinks. So there was no point in getting the heat pump to do the hot water. So it's only doing the heating, and so it's running 7 to 8 months a year, depending on how what the weather's like in sort of May and September. There is a 100-litre buffer tank in the bathroom, which you can see on the right there. I've put a shelf over the top and a plant on it. This helps reduce the strain on the heat pump and gives a supply of heat for defrosting. So basically, we've got a room stat in the hall thermometer that like you have on a normal gas boiler system. If the temperature drops below the temperature we've set it for, then it sends a message to the circulation pump to say, can we have some heat, please? The circulation pump will then draw heat from the buffer tank, and it's only when the buffer tank temperature starts to fall enough that the heat pump will then get into work to bring the buffer tank up to temperature, back to temperature. And the advantage of that is it stops short cycling. So the heat pump doesn't come on just for 5 minutes and switch off for 5 minutes and come back on again, which is not good. Now, the heat pump has what's known as weather compensation control on it. So we've set it to automatic. So the flow temperature depends on the outside. The flow temperature is the temperature of the water that's circulating around your radiators. So it's set so that this varies depending on the outside temperature. So on a colder day, the flow temperature might be as high as 45 degrees centigrade. On a milder day, it could be as low as 35 degrees centigrade. And basically, the lower the flow temperature, the more efficient your heat pump will be running. If necessary, I can switch out from automatic to manual, and I can put it to whatever flow temperature I want. I could put it up to 50 or even 55 degrees, but that will affect the efficiency of the system. So I tend to leave it in automatic. There is an electric under sink 15-litre Ariston water heater, does the hot water for the kitchen and the bathroom sinks. That's all the hot water we need. It seems to work fine. Now, I would just say, if you want a heat pump to do hot water as well, you would need a hot water cylinder. Heat pumps cannot provide instant hot water like a combi boiler does. Because we had a combi boiler before, we'd already taken out our water cylinder, and it would have been quite disruptive to put it back in. And basically, I would have had to have cleared out my office, which would have been a major task in order to get the pipes back under the floor to where the hot water tank would need to go. If you are using it to do your hot water, then generally what you would do is you'd set it up so that heat pump heats your hot water to 50 degrees using the heat pump most of the time. And then you have a boost about once a week to 60 degrees, which is protection against Legionnaire's disease. So you don't try and keep your tank to 60 degrees all the time. You don't need your water that hot. And again, having it at 50 degrees means your heat pump's running more efficiently than trying to get it to heat your water to 60. So the big question is it comfortable to live with? Well, yes, it is. We keep the hallway to 18 degrees during the day and drop the temperature back to 16 degrees at night. The living room is generally around 2 degrees warmer than this during the day. So we've got 20 degrees in the living room, which is fine. So the house never gets too cold and the heat pump rarely has to work hard. We very rarely use the wood stove, maybe once a year. I don't actually think we used it at all last winter, but we do occasionally use a fan heater first thing in the morning, just for sort of 20 minutes or so, getting out the shower. Might like the temperature slightly higher, you know, so we've got a fan heater there if we need it. So the heat pump is providing almost all of our heat. Now, I'm now going to show you a few graphs, and it might get a little bit techie, but stick with me. I'll try and keep it as clear and untechy as possible. So this is a measure of the kilowatt hours used by the heat pump every week for the year starting on the 16th of May 2021. So the figures up the side are kilowatt hours in a week. So the first few weeks it was on, it used 20 kilowatt hours or less. And then there was a period over the summer when it wasn't working, and then it came back on. There was another month or so when it was about 20 kilowatt hours. And then you can see, I don't know if you can see my cursor on the screen, I hope so, but then you can see it starts to rise. And then suddenly here, we're at the end of November and there was a cold spell. I'm not quite sure what happened in these 2 weeks, but presumably they were sudden mild weeks. But you can, and then by the time we get to February, actually I think February was quite mild last year, and then it drops down by April back to the sort of 20 kilowatt hours a week. You'll see that there are 8 weeks here which are considerably higher than the rest of the year. Those 8 weeks were all over 120 kilowatt hours a week and accounted for nearly 50% of the overall energy use of the heat pump. I'll come back to that one in a minute. So, and basically there is this thing called a coefficient of performance. It's basically a way of rating how efficient the heat pump is. Unfortunately, mine's a fairly simple system. It doesn't tell me what the coefficient of performance is, but comparing that use of 2,434 kilowatt hours of electricity in a year to my previous gas use, it's looking as though I'm getting a coefficient performance of around 3. So that's for every unit of electricity I put in to drive the system, I get 3 units of energy out. Now, some installers will tell you can get 3.5 or 4 units out for every unit of electricity you put in. That's certainly possible, but it would have to be a very well installed and very well run system to do that. Personally, I'm happy with a coefficient performance of 3. Second graph. So this is showing the PV generation. So the blue bits are the electricity that was exported, and the orange bits are the PV electricity that we used. And yeah, sorry, this graph starts in May, so it's not January to December. These graphs, they do start in May. So Christmas is this period in the middle in here where the PV is still generating something, but it's gone down. You know, here I think the lowest week here was about 4 kilowatt hours we got out of it, and the highest week up here in July was about 85 kilowatt hours. Interestingly, the PV system generated almost exactly the same amount of energy as the heat pump used, but of course they're not very well in sync. So even though we got a heat pump, we still exported nearly 70% of all the electricity that we generated. So of that 30% that we used in the house, I reckon about half of that went to the heat pump. So, you know, the heat pump, around 15% of the energy used by the heat pump came from the PV system. And this is I plotted the actual electricity usage weekly, including the contribution from the PV. So this is my total electricity use rather than my electricity purchases. And you can see there, the blue is the air source heat pump use, and the orange is other electric. So total electricity used in a year was just over 4,000 kilowatt hours, of which about 18% came from the PV. Now, at current electricity costs of 33p a kilowatt hour, that would cost me just over about £1,100 a year. Although it was a slightly milder winter last year, so for an average year, you can maybe add £100. So we're talking about £1,200 a year. That's total fuel costs. Now, economics. It cost me nearly £10,000 to fit. I'm getting 6,000 back roughly through the renewable heat incentive. Renewable heat incentive doesn't exist anymore, but the new grant scheme would give you about 5,000 up front. But I saved £3,000 cost of replacing the gas boiler. The gas boiler wasn't going to last much longer. And I'm also saving on, I've got rid of gas completely. So I've saved on the standing, on my gas meter. The maintenance and repair costs should be lower than a gas system. Fuel cost is similar to running the gas boiler. I expect the difference between electricity and gas prices to decrease over the next few years. So a heat pump should become a cheaper option than gas in the next few years. At the moment, it's pretty similar if you can get a coefficient performance of 3. Now, I've also plotted the heat pump usage against degree days. Now, degree days are a measure of how much heat you should require any particular day or week or month or year. And it enables you to compare energy use year by year, basically, is what it's normally used for, so that you can see, oh, my heating use has gone up by 10%. Is that because it's been colder, or is it because of other reasons? I'll come back to degree days in a second. Now, this is an almost perfect power curve. And what it's showing is, because that dotted line is curved, it's showing that the heat pump does get less efficient in colder weather. If it was a straight line, then every 10-degree days you added on, you'd get the same amount of extra energy usage. But because it's a curved line, it means at the top end, you don't need much additional degree day requirement, and yet the usage would become considerably higher. So there are 3 points here. I think this one, and this one, no, that one there, and those two are the furthest ones away from the line. So, well, why was that? Well, actually, I think it's because the house next door was empty, which is a thing which is often ignored with semi-detached houses, but it makes an awful lot of difference if the person next door has got the heating on or not, as to how much heat you need. Now, there is a slide here about degree days. There is a website, anyone can go to it. You select a weather station, you select whether you want the information daily, weekly, monthly, etc., and whether you want to cover the last 12 months. You also have to put in a base temperature. I chose 15 degrees. So basically that means if it's 15 degrees outside, I don't require any heating. If you were more elderly or you had a care home, you might set it to 17 degrees. So as soon as temperature falls below 17 degrees, you need heating. So the total degree days for May to April were 1774. This is 8% below the average for the last 3 years. So, you know, if we allow 12% extra for the heat pump to bring it to average, then it would add about £100 to the cost at 33p kilowatt and 60 kilos to the carbon footprint. I've also thought about, well, what if we get a really poor, bad winter, and instead of 8 weeks at high usage, we've got, 16 weeks at high usage. I reckon that would add about 250 quid to the cost. But of course, if we had a winter that went on like that, with it being really cold for 4 months, everybody's bills would go up. We've disconnected the gas fire, we fitted an induction hob, removed the gas meter, we save £160 a year in standing charges. The heat pump does what we ask of it. We could possibly do with a larger radiator in the living room. I need to take the old gas fire out to reduce ventilation losses in high winds. That's on my to-do list. The heat pump makes very little noise. Most people who've visited to have a look at it remark on how quiet it is. It can thrum a bit when it's working really hard, but then it's cold and people aren't sitting outside, drinking prosecco when it's that cold. So certainly nobody's complained. I would say that you need to be careful where you site the circulation pump, as it will come on cold nights and put a bit of heat around the house to stop the house getting too cold. But actually, the things I've really noticed is the pipes don't creak like they used to. I mean, we had it set up in a similar way with our old gas boiler, but then we had the nighttime temperature down at sort of 14 degrees or something, and occasionally the heating would come on in the middle of the night, and you would know straight away because the pipes under the floor would start creaking as they expanded. Don't get any of that now because of the lower flow temperature. So CO2 emissions are down to 660 kilograms a year and still falling because the carbon intensity of electricity in the grid is falling as we get more and more renewables. That doesn't account for the export of the PV or the green electricity supply. If we took those into account, then we'd be negative. We're only paying one standing charge. The EPC rating is now C. So this is CO2 emissions. Obviously, the 1930 one is a guess because I wasn't here in 1930. All the other figures are actual, based on my actual bills. And yes, I do still have my electricity bills from 1997. And the total electricity purchased has come down from around 19,000 kilowatt hours in 1997 to a net figure. So this is allowing for export of PV of only 1,300 kilowatt hours today. That's a reduction of 93% in energy used. And it works out, Jackie asked me this earlier, for the real geeky ones amongst you, that's 15 kilowatt hours per meter squared. And that's all energy for the house, not just for the heating. Any questions?
Thank you so much, Dave. That's absolutely brilliant, and so impressive of what you've achieved. The questions, Tony's going to be looking now through the questions that are in the chat, and it's going to be putting them to you, Dave. We can't ask this many people to shout out their questions. But meanwhile, while Tony's sorting through those, and while you're probably adding them, I found my second poll. So I'd like to share that, if I may. So this one is for people who already have a heat pump. And Dave, you can join in on this one yourself. So here you go. Right, for those who already have a heat pump, how happy are you with its performance? Now, I realize this isn't very sophisticated. If it's proper market research, I should give you at least 5 options. Good, we've got people registering it now. A very small number. I realize this is quite a risky thing to do. And the second question for those people who already have a heat pump is, did you do much insulation work to prepare your home? Again, this is not very scientific. So yes, a big insulation upgrade. Did a few things recommended on the EPC or by the advisor or installer, and nothing at all. It looks as though, oh no, we haven't finished yet. Dave, I was thinking when we've done this as well, it could be quite interesting before Tony kicks off with the questions, if you just say a little bit more about weather compensation and flow temperatures, because you've referred to them in the context of heat pumps, but there's a lot that people who have other forms of heating can do, isn't there, to reduce their consumption by adjusting flow temperatures?
Yes.
And,
it's funny, this is something which has only really been publicised recently. But if you've got an old-fashioned boiler, an oil boiler, say, or a non-condensing gas boiler, you might have a flow temperature around your system of around 70 degrees, which means your radiators will be very hot to the touch, which is why, you know, sometimes people put wooden frames around their radiators because they're so hot. If you've got a condensing boiler, then really your flow temperature wants to be down to about 60 degrees, because if the hot water gets back to your boiler and it's over 55 degrees, it will not condense. So a lot of plumbers apparently set up condensing boilers with flow temperatures that are too high, so they're not condensing properly So it's worth looking at the temperature gauge on your boiler and turning it down slightly. But beyond that, once you've got it to sort of the 60-degree level, going down any further is not going to make it more efficient. Whereas with a heat pump, the lower the flow temperature you get, the more efficient it will be. It seems slightly counterintuitive because you still need the same amount of heat out, but it works basically much more efficiently by providing you with more water at 45 degrees than it would with providing you with less water at 55 or 60 degrees. And I mean, it's something I haven't covered actually, but I think one of the biggest determinants of whether a heat pump is suitable for your home is how you use your home. Because of that lower flow temperature, the heat pump is basically, it's a slow react system. Now, you know, if your radiators are big enough and you've got your heating on for enough hours of the day, you should be able to heat most homes with a flow temperature of 45 degrees. But you can't let the house get too cold and expect a heat pump to bring it back up to temperature, you know, within an hour or two, as you would with an older gas or oil boiler. So it really suits people who are at home more, rather than, you know, if you've got intermittent use and somebody's out at work most of the day and then comes in for an hour or two to have their tea and then dashes out to yoga or to the allotment or something, then, you know, a heat pump is much less viable option, because you will be keeping the house not to, you know, high levels, but you will be keeping the house to reasonable levels of comfort for most of the time when nobody's in the house. So if you've got intermittent use, you might be better off with a quick react system. But if you've got reasonable use, you know, if you've got kids at home or people retired or you're working from home, then a heat pump can be very suitable.
Great, thanks so much for that, Dave. I'll share the results now of our poll of those who already have a heat pump, and we've had a couple of comments in the chat actually from people who have said, well, I didn't do extra insulation works because they'd already been done. So the numbers aren't quite right, but let's take a look in any case. So of the 14 people who responded, 8 said they're really happy. 5 think maybe it needs a bit of tweaking, and tweaking is something Dave might be able to tell us about later. And 1 person's really unhappy. So that's sad, but there are cases where, you know, things haven't been specified right, I guess.
Unfortunately, it's not uncommon. I'm on a heat pumps Facebook group. There are always people on there saying how their heat pump's not functioning properly. I mean, sometimes, you know, I do go and visit people and look at their heat pumps and talk to them about it. And sometimes it just comes down to the fact of, oh, my bills are high. But then when we look at it, the bills are high because the price of electricity has gone through the roof, not because they're using too much electricity. So that's the first thing to look at. You know, how much electricity is it actually using? Is it reasonable for the house and your occupancy? If the heat pump, if your electricity use is higher than it should be, then the first thing to look at is, you know, how are you controlling the system? Is your flow temperature too high? Are you trying to heat the house up from cold? Are you, you know, and various measures like that. If that's not the source of the problem, then it's possible that it's been set up wrongly. And unfortunately, that's it's not uncommon. I did actually visit a house fairly recently where the heat pump, the external unit for an air source heat pump, had basically been put in a stone outhouse with a closed door and window and no airflow. And you know, I've also visited a house where it was a council house or housing association house where the tenants had basically built an extension over the heat pump. So they were trying to extract heat from the house to heat the house, which really doesn't work. So yeah, if they're the things to look at. If anyone wants to contact me, if that one person wants to contact me, I'd be happy to talk through some of the issues with them.
Oh, that's very kind of you, Dave. Thanks. And yeah, just to clarify, this is all anonymous at the moment. So
Yes.
yeah, that one person, you could send a chat message now just to Dave that he will see, or contact him, his email. Perhaps you could put your email in the chat, Dave, or maybe Gemma can do that while we're doing this. On to question 2. Yes, a big insulation upgrade. Well, at least 2 or 3 people, I think, already had very well insulated houses. 6 of our 14 respondents on that did a few things, and 5 people did nothing at all. So thank you very much for that. And at this point, I'm going to hand over to Tony, who's going to go through the questions in the chat. And there we go. I'll mute myself. And Dave, I'm not sure whether you should stop sharing your screen now. You might want to hop back a little bit.
Do you want me to start talking now, Jackie?
That would be good, Tony. Have you got any questions for us?
Right, far away. Yes, we've got loads of interesting questions from the chat. So thanks very much, everyone, for chipping in. A lot of them about efficiency and about insulation. I'm going to throw a different one at you, Dave, which is about water source. It's something I'm curious about myself, because I live in Castlefields in Shrewsbury, next to this enormous river, which is a good thermal store most of the year. Have you got any thoughts on water source briefly, Dave?
Well, I'll cover water source and ground source at the same time, if that's okay. So the issue with air source heat pumps is that the efficiency does drop as the weather gets colder, which is obviously, you know, not ideal. So if you've got a ground source or a water source system, that effect is much reduced. Now, basically, water source and ground source systems use a similar technique. They're extracting air from, you know, the water or the ground, and then normally that refrigerant will then come into the house, and inside the house you'll have a bigger unit which then has the heat exchanger in it, which it produces the hot water. So whereas the air source heat pumps, that heat exchange happens in the outside unit, and the pipes running into the house actually have hot water in them. So both ground source and air source systems are more expensive to fit. They can be more efficient, so they would win out in a really cold winter, although water source, obviously, if it gets really, really cold and your water source starts to freeze up, which the River Severn has done, then that could cause some issues. One of the big issues now is that the boiler upgrade scheme grant will give you £5,000 towards the cost of an air source heat pump, and only £6,000 towards the cost of a ground or water source heat pump. And yet they cost normally at least twice as much to fit. So, you know, generally, I think they're going to wither on the vine, and who's going to pay twice as much for a system with a slightly higher efficiency if they only get an extra £1,000 in the grant scheme. Yeah. I have looked at a water source heat pumps on Lake Windermere, which would have been brilliant. Unfortunately, the YMCA that we were looking at it for, the use of their buildings actually drops off in cold weather. So their energy use simply wasn't high enough in the coldest weather to make it worthwhile. But certainly it's an interesting possibility.
Yeah.
But as I say, I think air source is probably the way to go now.
Sure. Okay. I'm just going to pick up another point quickly on the boiler upgrade scheme, because I was asked about an air-to-air system. So that's rather than air to water with radiators. It's quite unusual because obviously most people's homes are set up to the heat emitter in the home is the radiator.
Yes.
Does an air-to-air system qualify for the boiler upgrade scheme? The answer, I'm afraid, is no, because I've had a look and it doesn't.
Yes,
it
it
so
doesn't.
there you go. Just pick that one up. Right,
But,
Dave.
But
getting into...
I have to say, Tony, you can get an air-to-air heat pump fitted. I mean, basically, it will be called an air conditioning unit, but that's what it is. It's an air-to-air heat pump. The advantage is it could give you cooling as well in the summer. Now, I certainly would recommend that if you're using grid electricity to run that heat pump and get your cooling. But if you've got PV panels and you do suffer from overheating in the summer, then an air-to-air heat pump could be worth having. And they are a fraction of the price of an air source heat pump running radiators. I know somebody who's had one fitted for 1,500 quid. So, you know, possibly that could be a good solution for people who either don't already have a radiator system, or for one reason or another don't think that an air source heat pump could heat their whole house for the whole year. You could have an air-to-air system which is providing the heat for your living space certainly in the milder to cold weather, and then you switch over to your oil or gas boiler when it gets really cold.
Right. Okay, thank you. Right, we're going to go on to the magic topic of insulation. Obviously, what insulation is all about is heat demand reduction. I should point out in one of the polls, one of the people who was asked if they'd insulated their house beforehand, they said no, because they live in a certified passive house, so it was all covered mostly already, so it didn't need doing.
Yeah.
Right. Dave, what did you do? You started off talking about you put in some underfloor insulation, and then the next question is about your cavity. How deep is the cavity? So how much fill has it got?
Well, it's a normal cavity. It's about 50 mil. Now that's the standard size for a cavity. Now, one thing about cavity walls is the cavity's got to be wide enough. Sometimes they're only 30 odd mil, and then there's not enough room for the insulation to be spread around enough. And sometimes they're just too full of crap, basically. And what happened in my house is that when the window fitters put the new double glazing in, they just allowed a whole load of crap to fall down the cavities. So I actually fish that stuff out. I was taking the window boards out because I had horrible concrete window boards. So I smashed all those up, took them out, and that gave me access to the cavity so I could clean it out. If I hadn't have done that, then when the surveyor came around, he should not have recommended that I had insulation fitted, because that crap in the cavity would have caused potential damp problems as moisture could cross the cavity.
I should mention that cavities generally got bigger as time went by in the 20th century. More modern homes have got bigger cavities, and now they're getting huge. So the underfloor insulation, what was that? That's a suspended timber floor, was it?
It's a suspended timber floor in the living and dining room. I literally cut a hole in the corner of the floor, and I crawled underneath with some fiberglass, and I pushed it up into between the floor joists and stapled some netting underneath it. And as I say, it wasn't a pleasant job 25 years ago. I wouldn't even attempt it now. But I'm sure it has made a difference.
Okay.
Normally people say, well, if you're going to insulate the floor if you're taking all the floorboards up. Well, I didn't need to do that, so I wasn't going to take them up just just to insulate the floor. So I did the. I have seen a thing with some sort of robot that goes underneath and sprays a foam up underneath the floorboards. I'm not sure about that, because if your joists are into the wall and there's any moisture in the wall and the danger of the joist ends rotting, then spraying a foam onto them is not going to be a good idea.
Right, okay. Well, back to walls brief. We've got a question, it was a very good one, about well, single skin walls, by which we mean solid walls.
Yes.
30% of the homes in the UK are solid wall, either solid stone or solid brick, like mine, for instance, which is Victorian, very typical. So how does one go about insulating those? Because clearly they don't have a cavity. You having to pick that one up, Dave?
Yeah, slightly, not exactly on point, but I mean, you can externally insulate any home, but obviously if it's a Victorian property with fancy brickwork and all the rest of it, then you're probably not going to want to cover it up. But if it's a more boring property, or it's already rendered, then an insulated render on the outside would be the best way to go. You can also insulate internally. The advantage of that is you can do it room by room. It's not quite as effective, and you have to be careful that you don't then get condensation problems. But it's certainly possible. But a heat pump can work in a house with solid walls. Your heat pump's going to need to be bigger. Your radiators are going to need to be bigger. It's more important that you don't let the house get too cold. But, if you're already heating the house most of the time using an oil or gas boiler, then it's going to be not a lot different running it with a heat pump. But obviously, if we can get solid walls insulated, then that fabric first approach brings your energy use down initially, and then that enables you to fit a smaller heat pump, and it can run more efficiently and more cheaply. I would add that I think the biggest thing that people often ignore is actually sloping ceilings. If you've got most bedrooms have a flat ceiling, and it goes and it meets a wall like this. But how many houses, particularly Victorian houses, have a sloping ceiling like this? And people say, oh, well, I've insulated the loft. I've got 300 mil of insulation in my loft. And I say, well, what's behind your sloping ceiling? And they say, oh, I haven't thought about that. Well, normally your sloping ceiling's got, a half an inch of plaster and then the outside wall, basically. So if you've got an older property, I would say the priority is not doing the walls. The priority is to look at are your sloping ceilings insulated.
Okay, very good advice. Thank you for that. I should say insulation is a big topic, and it will be covered in future webinars. We're big fans of Fabric First because, as I say, it reduces demand, which is the key thing. However, if your priority, rather than saving money, is to decarbonize, is to save carbon, then as Dave says, you can install a heat pump today. And move your fuel from gas to renewable electricity, and you are decarbonizing. Right, we've got a slightly technical question about pipe work. Dave, what size is the pipe work?
I'm not going to answer this question. No.
In your house, is it Roy? Could you put yourself on a mute, please? Is it 15 mil or is it micro bore?
Yeah,
to the radiator?
No, the pipe work is 15 mil. Micro bore pipe, which is more like 10 mil, can be an issue, and it's a question of getting enough water around the system, because you need more water to be flowing around the system because it's at a lower flow temperature. If you've got micro bore pipe, that means your heating needs to be on for longer. It's going to be a slower react system. Your circulation pumps can be working harder. So it's not ideal. But it's not necessarily a no-no. I have heard of people with micro bore piping who've had a heat pump fitted. It just means your heat pump your circulation pump is going to have to work that much harder, and it's going to be an even slower react system than a normal heat pump.
Okay, right, similar questions then. What's the actual target flow temperature that you have at home? And connected to that, a question about, what's the, I suppose it's all relative, isn't it? What's the balance that you're looking for between the coefficient of performance and comfort in the home?
Well, yeah, because we're on the weather compensation control, the flow temperature will vary between about 35 degrees on a mild day up to 45 degrees when it's cold, and it's set to 45 degrees maximum. But I can override that if I want to. So if it is a cold day and I'm feeling cold and 45 degrees isn't delivering enough heat, then I can go to the controls, switch it over to manual, and increase the flow temperature. But there are graphs available, and you can see, that your efficiency really does start to drop off with the higher flow temperatures. So, that extra heat will be more expensive than if you're running it at a lower flow temperature. Now, some heat pumps have slightly more complicated controls. I like to keep things simple. I mean, I could have spent a lot more on the heat pump if I'd wanted all the fancy, gadgets and gizmos to go with it. Being a bit of a miser, I thought, no, I don't need all that. I'll spend that money on a new bike. But with the more fancy controls, they often have in there, built into the controls, what's known as a compensation curve. And that will set so you've got a variety of options for how the weather compensation sets your temperature. And I visited one property recently, and basically we think we've improved the efficiency considerably by changing the compensation curve they're on. Basically their flow temperature was going up too fast, too soon, and was set to a maximum of 50 degrees rather than 45. So their system would run more efficiently on a flatter compensation curve, to use the jargon.
Okay, a similar question, I think, is how are you finding the temperature? Presumably it's more stable than you had when you had gas boiler. And
yeah, I mean, we used to run the gas boiler fairly similarly. Because I work from home most of the time, my lodger's retired. Most heating programmers these days, they don't have an on-off anyway. You just set different temperatures for different times of the day. So it's not that different to how we used to run the system. What I would say now is that, occasionally there's an evening where I think, oh, I would like it, 1 or 2 degrees warmer in here. And previously I would have probably gone and switched the thermostat up on the in the hallway, and let the gas boiler bring the house up that couple of degrees very quickly. Whereas now I think, well, it's not worth doing that with a heat pump because it's going to take an hour and by that time I'll be in bed, so I go and put another jumper on. So
okay,
I mean that's very rare, and it tends to be the evenings, as I say, where it's down to me, not down to the temperature of the room. Right. It's more to do with I'm tired and blood's not flowing and all the rest of it.
We're still getting questions coming through. There are quite a few to bash through, Dave. Similar question: what time does the heat pump go back to 16 degrees? That's the night setting, I think.
I think we've got it at 10 o'clock.
Okay, right.
And it comes back on to 18 at 6:30 in the morning, and we tend to get up about 7:30.
Okay.
So yeah.
Right, thank you very much. A few people are interested, asking questions about not just the solar PV, but fitting a battery. Would it be ideal? Would it be optimal to fit the battery so that you can get maximum use out of your own generation?
Yeah.
Does that work with the heat pump?
Well, I've looked into it, and I think even with electricity prices at 33p a kilowatt hour, it would still, a battery would still struggle to pay for itself. Now, I am exporting nearly 70% of what I generate. So it seems to make sense to have a battery to hold on to that electricity and use it in the home. But you've got to bear in mind that that electricity that I'm exporting is not wasted. You know, my neighbours are using it, basically, and that's electricity that they're not calling for from the grid. So if you had a 5 kilowatt hour battery, which is the sort of basic size, well, that's holding 5 kilowatt hours of electricity. Well, at 33p a kilowatt hour, that means it's holding £1.60's worth of electricity. That's all. So if I was to fully charge it and fully discharge it every day of the year, that would be what, 500 quid's worth? But it's not going to do that. So, you know, if it did half that, it would be doing well. That's about 250 quid. And what's the cost of a 5 kilowatt hour battery? 4,000 quid? 5,000 quid? Doesn't stack up in my mind. And then you've got the lithium in the battery, you've got the mining, you've got all the rest of it for a bit of kit that's sitting there, and you know, 8 months of the year it's going to be doing nothing. It's only 4 months of the year when it's going to be really active, when the PV is peaking.
Although I should probably point out, it's possible with like an Octopus Agile tariff to purchase electricity in the middle of the night, say from Welsh wind farms. No, not purchase it. Sorry, be paid to take it.
Yes. Yeah, if you want to get into buying and selling electricity from the grid, then a battery might be worth it. I'd be very dubious about. I mean, the Octopus Agile tariff had a thing where, you know, oh, we will pay you to use electricity at certain times of the day, but that your maximum rate is going to be 33p. And this was at a time when everybody else was paying sort of 15, 16. And the Octopus Agile tariff works on spot prices. So anyone on Agile was completely unprotected when the wholesale price went through the roof. And suddenly Agile customers were spending 35p a kilowatt hour or 33p a kilowatt hour most of the day, when the rest of us were all still only paying 16p.
Okay.
So there is an issue there. I think battery storage is really important. I think it's better at scale. So, you know, megawatts of battery storage or gigawatts, and that's what's happening. I think there's one being built between Coventry and Birmingham.
Okay, Dave, we mustn't get distracted.
Yes.
Onto your other job. Let's stick with heat pumps. Can you? So we've got 23 questions to get through if we can.
Right.
Can you? I think I can answer this one. Can you hear or feel the vibration of the heat pumps as it's fitted to the wall? It's not really fitted to the wall, is it? Because it's away from your wall and it's on rubber feet to soak up some of the vibrations.
Yeah, no, it doesn't vibrate. As I said, when it's working really hard in the coldest weather, it does thrum a bit. But I can only hear it outside. I can't hear it in the house at all.
Right. So you don't feel the vibrations in the house. Okay.
No.
Your degree day chart, what was it on the horizontal axis?
So we had degree days up the side and we had kilowatt hours along the bottom.
Right. Okay. Thank you very much. What material?
And that's kilowatt hours. It's that's per week. So it's degree days per individual week and kilowatt hours used by the heat pump in a week.
Okay. Question, what material did you use in the cavity wall insulation? I hope it wasn't urethane foam.
No, they don't use urethane foam anymore. I haven't done for a long time. It's basically little, it's a sort of fiberglassy material. You either use that or a polystyrene bead.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting general question. What would you do differently? Are you happy with everything you've done, I guess?
What I do differently? A larger radiator in the living room, just for those occasional evenings when I need a little bit of extra heat. The big thing I need to do is remove the gas fire. I haven't got around to doing that there. Interestingly, everything I've done, I reckon, has paid for itself easily. Now, with the PV, that's because I've had the feed-in tariff, but it would be more difficult to justify the PV now without the feed-in tariff. The one thing that I think actually cost me money was probably the gas boiler, because yeah, it saved quite a lot of gas, but gas at that time was a relatively cheap fuel, and it only really lasted 10 years before it needed major works doing to it. So if anything, that was the worst investment decision out of all the ones I've taken.
Right, I've got a question about air tightness. I should mention again, this will be covered in future webinars. We talk a lot about insulation, but air tightness is very important. It's a sort of a first step in your fabric first, and it can be a very inexpensive way to make a big difference. For instance, putting a draft excluder over your post box, if you have one in your door, which is a huge hole in your house letting in cold air. So any suggestions around air tightness? Do you have mechanical ventilation, etc.?
No. No, the house isn't particularly airtight. As I say, I need to get rid of the gas fire because the wind howls through that when it's very windy. And it is noticeable that the days the heat pump struggles is not when it's very cold, it's when it's very windy, because you've got extra heat loss from the increased ventilation rate, and you've got a chill factor on the house as well. So I do need to do a bit more sealing. And yeah, mechanical ventilation, I presume they mean with heat recovery. It's a quite difficult thing to fit for a retrofit project. You know, I have seen it done, but it's quite rare. And you need a well-sealed house in order to make you know, that ventilation with heat recovery really worth doing. So yeah, mine probably doesn't qualify.
Okay, got another comment here about battery on PV and getting EWI, which is external wall insulation, which is probably a good idea, especially if you don't have a cavity, as previously discussed. Another comment about MJS, very good service from them. They were the guys who installed Dave's heat pump. Right, one specific question. Why would one radiator heat in the bathroom heat up less quickly than the others? Tricky one.
I don't think I said that, did I? I think I said, what I said was about putting a fan heater on early in the morning when I came out of the shower. The fan heater is actually in where I get dressed, so it was about having a warm thing while I'm drying off and getting dressed.
Okay.
The bathroom radiators are often small though, so yeah, that's one thing to take into account.
Okay. Sorry, how many kilowatts were installed for £1,500? I think that was the
air-to-air source heat pump is a 5 kilowatt system, which seems big to me for what it is. Mine's a 7 kilowatt for my whole house, and this is a 5 kilowatt system, which is basically just heating a sort of through lounge dining space.
Okay. Right, we've got a suggestion here that the Qbot, the robot that goes underneath the floor, which you mentioned, Dave, one of our participants is suggesting it is being highly recommended by a good source. It's supposed to be vapor permeable, so shouldn't cause damp issues. Also airtight, so good against drafts. I think I know a couple of architects who would disagree with that, but that will probably come up in another webinar, so let's get into it then. Sorry, I'm getting into questions that I haven't already read. How much carbon emissions would we save if we changed from 100% wood fuel stoves to air source heat pump? Well, that's an interesting question. It's very difficult to calculate the carbon footprint of wood because it depends what it is, how quickly it grows, how quickly it's replanted, So yeah, I'll throw that one at you, Dave, if you want to have a go.
Well, I think wood heating has a role to play, particularly as a secondary heating for people living in rural areas. I no longer really think it's an option for whole house heating, and I wouldn't have it as a regular secondary heating in a built up area.
I was going to say, it's not just a question of the carbon, there's also the particulates.
There's particulates, the air quality and all the rest of it. Now, if you've got a good quality wood stove and you're burning dry timber and you're burning it reasonably fast, then the emissions are very low. The carbon factor, well, if it's being replaced by you know, tree for tree, or 2 trees for every tree that comes down, and it's locally sourced, and the carbon factor is going to be incredibly low already. So I think that it's a good combination. If you've got a air source heat pump and you've got a wood stove that you can use on the coldest weather when your air source heat pump is least efficient, then that to me makes a lot of sense.
Okay, interesting question from Trish regarding setting up, sort of tuning the air source heat pump correctly, which is something that Dakin also mentioned a few weeks ago. I'm in the dark regarding my controls. Is there anyone who can come and help me change my settings? Our fitters seem too busy to come back. It must be said, there are some air source heat pump installers out there who are quite keen to get hold of the boiler upgrade scheme money while it's available, and are sort of fitting hell for leather. So do pick your installer carefully, and they should obviously take the time to do well, to give you a proper service and fit it properly and tune it to your needs and requirements. So I guess it's their responsibility, really, the people who fitted it, to come back.
Yeah, but I have come across cases of where, you know, the installers might know how to install it, but they don't really know about setting the controls to make them most efficient. And they will normally say, oh, just leave them, don't touch the controls, just let it do its thing, and which is fine if they've set them up properly. But if they haven't, then obviously that's bad. I can, if Trish wants to get in contact with me, I'd be happy to have a look at her system and talk her through it on the phone, and possibly even visit if that could be useful.
Okay,
depending on where she is.
That's great. Okay, Charles, we've got a question from you, which is probably far too broad to deal with now, but it's regarding a grade 2 listed 400-year-old building where double glazing, cavity wall, solar PV, etc. are frowned on by the local authority conservation officers. That is an interesting question, because as I mentioned, I live in a conservation area of Shrewsbury where there are hundreds of terraced Victorian houses that will all need wall insulation at some point, and externally it cannot be done because we won't get planning permission at the moment, so that may have to change. Charles, I would suggest apply for a survey under Future Ready Homes, and we'll see if we can give you some good advice, but it's a very valid point. Do you want to comment briefly, Dave, on that?
Yeah, there's normally something you can do, you know, loft insulation, sloping ceilings, secondary glazing. You can put PV panels on a listed building. You need permission and you might have to appeal, but Berrington Hall just south of Shrewsbury is grade 2 listed, and they've got a 5 kilowatt PV system on the roof that you see as you approach the building.
Okay. Right, there's a certain amount of squabbling over batteries on the chat and how long they last and whether they work. Sorry, I'm just trying to get through this.
Oh, you're looking, Tony. I was just going to say as well, unfortunately, Jeff Wilkinson, building inspector, who has been with us for the majority of this webinar, has dropped off. So it would have been quite nice to hear what he had to say.
Oh, actually, we've run out of questions because a lot of those was disagreements over batteries. And lots of thanks for a wonderful presentation, of course, very useful, very Jackie pointing out, of course, that all installers should be MCS accredited, and they would have to be for them to get the boiler upgrade scheme, which is applied for by the installer rather than by the householder.
Yeah, You also, if you're going to apply for the boiler upgrade scheme, you do need an energy performance certificate, and it shouldn't be recommending cavity fill or loft insulation. It's not worried about solid walls or sloping ceilings or inaccessible lofts, but those two things it should not be recommending. And we do have one final slide, so if I share my two events coming up.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for that, Dave. Yes, and by the way, I put a link in the chat, which is a link to a SPAB document on retrofit of heritage buildings, and we have got a talk on that coming up in January. But nearer than that, the Herefordshire Green Network Building Sense group are going to be at Colwall Greener Eco Festival. That's Colwall near Malvern, which is, they've done a brilliant sounding job of setting that up for us. And then on the 30th of November, we shall be hearing from Gervais Manguana, who is going to be talking about getting your building heat pump ready. So making sure that your home is optimized to take a heat pump, essentially of smallest size, so that you can get all the benefits without too much power consumption. So Dave, are you, I think you're done. Tony's done with the questions. Yep, that's lovely. So it just remains for me to say thank you so very much to everybody for taking part. Thank you, of course, Dave in particular for doing the presentation for us. Thank you, Gemma, for all the hard work in letting everybody know that this was taking place, and to Tony for a brilliant job with the Q&A, which is never an easy job. And in particular, thank you to everyone who's been along to take part. It's brilliant to have such a great audience. So thank you, and have a great afternoon. Bye-bye.
I'll see you at the next one. Thank you.
Cheers, Jackie. Thank you for organising it.
Thanks, Dave.
Bye.
Well done.
Bye.